Hi, and welcome to the DGU event, How to Navigate the Complex World of Federal Digital Policy. We're joined today by Tori Garten. In her role as Chief of the New Media and Web Policy Branch at the NIAID, one of the 27 institutes of centers of NIH, Tori Garten's professional goal is to help government function faster and be more flexible and more fluid from the inside out. Tori enjoys solving digital communications challenges and helping others to understand and operate in this ever-evolving ecosystem. Of note, we need to inform you that this webinar is being recorded. And also of note, we have to inform you that this presentation is a case study for NIH and is not necessarily a representation of GSA policy. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Tori. Thank you so much for joining us today. And 1 second as we pull up her presentation.
Great. And while that's happening, so thank you for the great introduction. And one of the things I think that's interesting in spelling out where we work is it really shows us how complex the federal government is. And you have lots of acronyms, lots of layers, lots of hierarchy. And that comes into play when we're trying to understand what policy to apply and where to apply it and how to apply it. And so I think it's just something for us all to sort of recognize that depending on where you sit in the government, you might have a different sort of understanding of policy. So today I'm going to talk with you about how NIAID, which stands for the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Enter, there we go. Okay. So you see the titles here, and we're part of NIH, National Institutes of Health, which is a part of Health and Human Services, which is agency level. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about how at NIAID, in my office, the New Media and Web Policy Branch, how we had a need to sort of really get a deep understanding of digital policy. It's sort of all of our responsibilities to understand policy, apply it accurately, how to, and comply with it. And so the question is, how do we do that when there's now so much out there? So I wanted to bring up a scenario. You guys can tell me which way you prefer to say that. So, you're sitting there innocently on a Monday and a question related to digital policy arrives in your email box. And maybe it's a question that's, about what can you link to? And maybe you have a really solid understanding of that. And so you're like, yes, you're like a little success baby. And you're like, yes, I know the answer. And you shoot off an answer, maybe a link to information to back up your answer. Or maybe you get a question that comes in and you think, oh no, I don't know the answer. And so I don't know if you're anything like me, I feel like I should know all the answers. And so when one comes in that's challenging, it's sort of like, oh, okay, so how do I figure this out? And maybe you're brand new or relatively new in the federal digital government world. And you might think, oh yeah, totally can do that. We did that in the outside real world. Why couldn't we do it here? And you get yourself in trouble or someone else a little bit in hot water. Or maybe you've been around for, 900 years and you're sitting there thinking, you're going back through like your mind palace of, well, there was that email from that guy, and it was before social media, so it was before 2010, and I think he's left now, but there was an email about this policy about you could either do XYZ or you couldn't do XYZ. But then you're not really sure, has that been overwritten by a new policy, overcome by events, what's the deal here? So if you're anything like me, you might ask coworkers who might have an idea. You might search existing policy content, and there's a lot of information out there. You might ask one of these great listservs that we have access to, the Content Managers Forum, the mobile listserv, the social media listserv. These are all great resources that, back in 2003 when I started, we didn't really have. So we have a lot of great resources now to help us do our jobs better. It's just there's a lot of information. Or you might sort of ask somebody directly, a colleague at another part of the government. You might be like, hey, and maybe you're even asking on the down low a little bit because you're not sure what the answer is you're going to get and if you're going to agree with it or if it's going to cause you more troubles. And so that's what I sort of talk about is I call it the policy swirl, where you're going about your day and a question comes in and now this becomes your main focus because you need to get an answer because this stakeholder needs to communicate or create a system and they need the answer to this question. So I've started diving into the problem a little bit, and I crossed out problem here and I put in challenge, right? The idea being that challenges are just things that are hard but can be solved, whereas a problem is just really annoying. So let's think about this as a challenge, because if it's a challenge, we just have to put in the right level of effort and break it down in the right way to get to a good answer, or to feel better about what we're trying to accomplish. So I think part of the challenge is, where do I find all these applicable laws? Where are they all? Now, we have this great resource, the digital.gov site has a lot of these laws, regulations, policies, and that is a huge benefit that we didn't have years ago. But there's other laws that sometimes come into play. So depending on where you sit in your organization, you might be communications, or you might be IT, or you might be in that wonderful world of web where we sit between the two and nobody's really comfortable with what you do. So, so it might be that there's some technical or IT related policies, security policies, that if you're the first line of defense, it would be good if you had an idea about them. So then the next one is, what do these policies actually mean? Like, what do these words actually say? And how do I comply? Or how do you define compliance? I think that's one of the challenging pieces. And then also, in my office, we've been having this battle for, 15 years about whether to call things policies, standards, or guidelines, or how do you define what those three are? And then we add in regulation and laws, which I just realized is the title on the digital.gov checklist the other day. I was like, oh, look at that, more words. So what do those mean? And do they imply some certain level of stuff? I don't want to just keep saying compliance. Is there a certain level there? Are some things more important than others? Do some things sort of go off and you don't have to worry about them as much? Or another one's just like, you have to do it or it's a no-go. So, and then if you manage more than one site, or depending on your role in your organization, maybe you manage the public site, but you have interactions with other sites that are managed by other people. So depending on the nature of these sites, which ones need to comply with what? Do they all comply with everything? Do they comply with a subset of the policies? So it's something for us to look into. Then of course, the complex language. We have plain language as a policy, and yet sometimes when you read policy, it's sort of like, whoa, what happened to the plain language? Or there's different words mean different things. So for example, I think there is some memorandum or maybe one of the acts that refers to executive or executive agency. So I Googled that and I went to the section whatever of the code of law, and it sort of self-defined itself, which I was like, oh, well, that's not really helpful. So, we have these challenges with that. And then, what if it changes? So the 21st Century Idea Act just came out. It didn't really change much, more sort of incorporated a lot of really great things most of us are already doing, but we have to make sure we check through that and say, did something change? Has something been let go of? Has something been improved or modified? And so we have to track all this. So one of the ways I've been thinking about this challenge is, how can I slice these things into some particular large buckets? And if I can figure out ways to address these pieces of the challenge, these slices, will that help me get further and, be a little less sort of swirling around? The other thing too is I want to be consistent, right? So I want to be consistent in my responses. I don't want to tell one person one thing one day and the next day tell somebody else something else, right? That sort of gets to, you start to not be trusted as an authoritative source, or as the go-to person if your answers sort of change with the wind. So how do I have good, solid answers with appropriate exceptions? And then how do I document and keep track of all that? So that, 3 years from now, when the same question comes up, I know what I said to person A versus person B. So let's talk about the challenge of language a little bit. And I actually put in some words here that when I've talked about this before, people say, well, what's an optive? What's a staffdiv? So there's agency level sites. So as I mentioned, HHS is the agency that my institute falls under, that I work for. So in HHS, there's things called optives, right? It's a very government jargon. And when you start working for the government, it's pretty insane. You need an acronym list. So an optive would be something like FDA, CDC, NIH, right? Those are big parts of HHS that have sort of their particular missions, which channel up to the HHS mission. And then a staffdiv would be another level of organization. So parts of NIH, there's, whether or not you know it or not, Alex mentioned there's 27 institutes and centers. So, to some people, NIH is just one big thing. For those of us who work there, the question is always, well, what institute do you work for, right? So that's how we sort of talk to each other. And that would be a staffdiv. So when I'm trying to understand policy, I have these levels and layers to think about. The next one is, what exactly is considered government? It seems straightforward, right? I'm a federal employee. My badge says I'm a federal employee. You know, I don't have the little yellow badge thing on it that says I'm a contractor, which I used to have. There's nothing wrong with that. So what is considered government? So it's a site that's built by an agency, a government site. That's pretty easy when it's your flagship public-facing website. It has, you know, stuff about your budget and your about section and your leadership and news releases and things like that on it, and stuff particular to your mission. But what about things that are funded by a contract? Now, it could be that contractors are actually building a lot of these sites within the agency, but perhaps there's something, so NIH, we do science, we do research. So maybe there's a contract that is, its purpose is to do science. But as part of doing the science, they need a website to communicate with collaborators or to share data or to share policies, their own policies, right? So, but maybe that's funded by a contract, or maybe something's funded by a grant. So maybe it's an educational organization that's received a grant to do research. So are there any policies that apply or don't apply in those situations? So you can see how it starts to get rather complex pretty quickly when you're being asked different questions. And now you have to ask back a lot of different questions, at least in my case. Then there's the option of maybe there's more than one organization involved. So maybe it's a cooperative agreement, or it's a joint project between agencies. That's always great. But then the question is, well, whose logo goes where? Which .gov is it? What domain name gets used? How are those decisions made? And there's what I call a network. So maybe there's a connection or a partnership between a researcher that's a government researcher, and they're partnering with someone from another organization, and then they're all partnering with, say, the Bill Gates Foundation or some other foundation like that. Well, how does that work? Because now it's not just government. So is that a .gov? Is it not a .gov? What are the rules that apply to all that? And some of that is actually more clearly spelled out, but that's one of the things that does come up frequently, that we actually go back and check. Well, what do the rules say? What did they say last year? 5 years ago? What do they say now? And then I think what's gotten really complex is, what type of site is it? And maybe we just need a better label. I was just thinking about this on the way down here. You know, should we even worry about whether it's a website or an application or a digital service or a third-party platform? Or is it a collaboration site, a transactional site, a database? Is it used for data sharing? Part of what I was thinking about is, well, what do these all have in common? You're looking at them through a screen, and you're interacting probably through some sort of typing, right? It's not even a keyboard necessarily anymore. I mean, do you call that a keyboard when it's on your phone? So are there different slices and dices of stuff? And we have these conversations all the time at NIAID. So maybe you're having those kinds of conversations in your organization as well. And then going back to the definition one about law, regulation, policy, standard, guidelines, best practices. You know, we have certain beliefs about how we think things should look, but what of those are actually required from a policy perspective to be compliant? So this challenge of language, this was just an example of, and again, this is just our little, try not to read the little Post-it notes too closely. This is a tool we use called Miro board. It's called something else before, let's use Post-it notes. But we were trying to really define what is our criteria for when something goes on the public site, when does it get its own site, when is it not a .gov, or when do we need more information to even decide? And so we started thinking about what categories, so on the left, what categories of questions would impact that decision. And so you can see it got rather complex, and we had multiple people using multiple colors, adding their thoughts. And so part of this was getting to, you know, understanding the language and then setting up criteria that we could follow consistently. And so we're still working through a bit of that, but I thought I'd show you a little example of some of the work we started to do. And we sort of did this in concert with trying to understand the policies and chunk the policies up, because it's really an iterative process, right? So one question always then makes you go down a different rabbit hole, and then you come back up, and then you think you got things settled, and then you go down another rabbit hole. And so this is how we sort of started to parse things out a little bit. Oops. There we go. So next, after language, I think a common, and this wasn't even in that first, you know, problems, challenges page, that one, we don't really even bring out there. When you're reading all the policies, we don't really think about the cultural challenges. So what are the organizational cultural challenges to implementing policy? And so I think that's something I'd like to have more discussions about how are people successfully bringing their stakeholders along in adopting federal web policy. You know, I was sitting there thinking the other day, the federal government is not a web organization, right? We're not web developers. We're not going out designing websites for just anyone. we're designing and building websites or services or whatever you want to call it, to support our missions, the missions of our organizations. So the work of our organizations is the mission, and building websites is in support of that. So, as the holders of website stuff, of policies, best practices, standards, we want citizens to get the best experience. And with citizens, I include everybody. So I include the people who are also, in our case, applying for funding, the researchers who are looking for a collaborator, students who want to get into science, or we want to encourage students to get into science, right? The whole STEM thing, getting more people in science so we can address some of these challenges that we have scientifically. So how do we bring these organizations on along with us when what they want is to put their stuff out as quickly as possible? And they don't really necessarily care that there's 2.5 inches of a policy double-sided printed out. And it shouldn't be the concern. So how do I facilitate success for somebody who has something to communicate without making it overly burdensome for them, but also keep us from stepping in hot water, or also keep us from creating something that isn't worth the money that was spent, right? So if we create something and we don't follow any policies, if it's not usable, then it was a waste of taxpayer dollars. So that's where I sort of come down on the importance and value of policy is to meet citizens' needs, to make things easy and understandable, but also how do we support the mission at the same time? And nobody wants to hear me talk about 5-weight all the time, but it comes up all the time. And so how do I start to frame that in a way that people can understand and not just brush it off or feel like it's an impediment to their success? How do I couch it in a way so they see it as helping them achieve their goals? Following policy, can make a better website. And I actually truly believe that. And if a policy doesn't help us build a better website, well, that's a conversation we should be having in this community and saying, well, you know what? This seemed like a good idea, but now the implementation of it is causing other issues. So do we get this right the first time? Do we need to change the policy? Is there technology that needs to be built? So I think a lot of this is sort of an iterative process and an iterative conversation to make all of our sites better and support our missions better. So next, so this is a brief little side comment. So I always think it's funny when I start talking about policy. It's funny to me because I have a lot of gray in my brain, and not just gray matter, but I see a lot of nuance. So for me, policy is challenging because I'm not like a black and white, like, it must be this way. A lot of times I can see the sort of other side in a sense and go, oh, you know what? Well, in this case, yeah, I can see why they find this frustrating, but how do we meet both needs? And so 2 ways it's good to have people that you're working with who are more black and white, but also, it gets to the point of not using policy as punishment. And this gets to the cultural piece a little bit. So if we're only ever addressing policy to punish people for doing the wrong thing, then they're never going to be true believers. They're never going to come around. So while we're enforcing policy or leading policy changes or encouraging compliance, can we do it in a way where it's more consultative, it's more educational, where they sort of start to buy into the value of the policy more than just being whether or not they're compliant or not compliant. And so I think that's the approach we've been trying to take a little bit, is not just to say, no, you can't, you do advertisement, it's more, or you can in certain cases, but here's the reasons why, and helping to give them some of that background information without also overwhelming them with stuff that they may not care about in 2 weeks. So this is where I always think about the carrot and the stick. And sometimes having that stick of policy is helpful. Sometimes it's helpful for me that HHS or digital.gov states that something must be this way, because then I go, oh, look, they said it has to be this way. But the carrot is also valuable. When you have a large organization and there are things that are out there, they got out of the gate before we were involved, they got out of the gate before there was a lot of policy. So you have these existing portfolios or sites or that are out there that it costs money to bring them into compliance. So how do we fit that in? How do we encourage them? How do we show them that there's going to be value to their users and to their own work to comply? And that's really sort of the carrot piece that I was talking about a little bit earlier. So, so what are these guidelines? What are these policies, laws, regulations? What are these? What are we actually talking about here? And this is sort of the third challenge, which is the plethora, I really like that word, the plethora of policy that exists, and how it's really, in the last, so if we go back to May 2012, so we're in 2019, so in the last 7 years has been even more information. Plus we have all the other federal laws that come into play. So these are those overarching ones, and you can find these on the lovely DigitalGov checklist. And I always go back to that as a resource, as a starting point. It's really helpful. And you'll notice that the top one, whoops, oh yeah, here we go, the DigitalGov site. It's got lots of information on it. And so I use that all the time, as I said, but one of my challenges is if I'm working with a stakeholder or a program officer who has funded something and they have a contract and they have contractors, if I just send them to this site, they're not going to come away with the same answers that I am going to come away with, or the same requirements. So how do I close that gap? How do I make sure that I can audit a site or work with people to make sure they're getting the right answers, so that we don't have a lot of back and forth? And so that's really what we started to look at was, okay, so here at NIAD, we work with different stakeholders, different types of sites, our public site. How do we make this easier to digest? So just like like we would do for any website or web content, can I make this digestible, you know, the whole snack bite meal? How do I do that for people whose jobs aren't web? So I think if your job is web, this is, you know, awesome, and we can really digest a lot of it. But how do I make that into something that someone else who has 14 other mission-related things that are not web, how do I get them to understand what we need? So, and just to mention, along with that sort of carrot stick idea, I was actually pretty excited when I saw the 21st Century Idea Act was coming out, because I felt like it was going to give us a lot more, in some ways, like authority, right? So we have these memorandums, we have executive orders, but this is an actual law. And I'm not even quite sure what the difference is between laws and executive order, you know, in terms of what's required. And so I thought it was really helpful to have this coming out. And it also made us kind of lit the fire a little bit for us to say, you know what, if this comes out and we have to respond to data calls along these topics, how are we going to do that? How are we going to be prepared? Not, you know, the data call can have whatever it's going to have in it, but how do I know for my own assurance where we are, where our performance is with compliance with digital federal policy? And so that sort of spurred us into more activity to see if we could get a handle for ourselves on understanding policy. So I just put this slide in here. So if you haven't read the 21st Century ID Act, I am not an expert on it, but website modernization in particular, as you can tell, relates to websites. So if you haven't read the act, you should go read the act, because I think it has a lot of valuable points in it, and it can help us move further into our understanding of policy. And also to say, I'll come back to that in a second. So that's just sort of a plug for reading that. And of course, the folks here at digital.gov are the experts on the IDEA Act. And so, you know, if you have any questions, they're the folks to ask, not me. But I just want to put that out there. But I think it is a really valuable, and it's new, and it's framed in certain ways, and it really pulls together things that were in different documents before. And so it's something for us to pay attention to. So as we started down this path, I put this little picture of the map in here. Actually, I just hiked this the other day, and it was a lot harder than I thought. So you haven't done all rag, take extra water. So we wanted to have a way to figure this out. And so we started on this journey. And so when you have a journey, you need a map, maybe you need a process, maybe you need someone in charge of snacks. And those things all come into play. You should always have snacks when you're reading policy. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about where we started and how we got there. So what was our process? I'm going to go into these each in a little more detail, but just to give you a roadmap, a little map there of where we're going. And this sort of, I think of this as the second half of the presentation. So the first half was really, what are the challenges? And this part is really, well, okay, we broke that down into, we had challenges with language, we have cultural challenges, and we have the quantity of policy, which ties back also into our language challenge. So the first thing that we did was we read all the policies. I'll go into that a little more in graphic detail. No. And then we created a tracking spreadsheet to sort of sort things out. And then we refined that into a sort of a beta policy compliance audit checklist. Those words all sound very important. I don't know if I need all of those in the title, but we're working through that. And then we used a tool called content entry forms, which I'll talk about some more. And then we started to test it. So we tried to be pretty specific in figuring out, you know, we didn't want to just create something for ourselves that we then figured out didn't actually work. But it was also really illuminating to do these test runs because it helped us understand going back to the problem of language, who understood certain things in certain ways versus other people, even within our own office, which then you just expand that across the federal government. And now you can see where we all have different ideas about what the policies are and why they get implemented differently. So this is my cat, one of my cats. So where did we start? So I sat down, I printed out, and I'm a little bit of a tree hugger, so it was really hard for me to print these all out, but I did it double-sided. And for me, it went back, harken back to the old days of writing a term paper or something like that. And so I had my highlighter, I had my coffee, and sat there and read through a lot of these top level, almost actually all of them, the top level policy standards and guidelines. And if you haven't done that, it's quite educational, right? And so some of them are written more clearly than others. Some of them are more specific. Some of them are less so. Some overlap, some don't. And so I started with that and started to think about as I read them, can I lump these into categories? And I started with the categories that are on the digital.gov site originally. And then I narrowed those categories down from there to make it easier in the long run. Potentially. And then we read through the HHS as the agency has policies. So we had to go back and read through those and figure out, well, some of these are required, some of them aren't, some of them are recommendations. We like some of them, we want to adopt some of them, but some of them maybe are older and we don't need anymore. So for example, there used to be a policy that you needed to have on your website a link to all the plugins. I don't know, maybe that's still required, but I will admit that I don't do that anymore because it just seems like overcome by events. And it seems weird to have to provide an update for how to download like Chrome or something like that. So that's just an example of a policy that used to be very important because people didn't have PDF readers. They didn't have, ways to read Microsoft and that stuff. So a lot of that's just gotten easier over time as technology's improved. Then of course there's NIH policies, and then we have policies, although maybe we should call them standards and guidelines. This is again a language thing, for our own institute, things that we say yes to or no to, things we do on our public site that we've made decisions on that we want to stay consistent with. And then I put Tori's personal preferences here in with a little asterisk because we actually really try to not have personal preferences be the deciding point. And of course, everybody in the office has different personal preferences. So what we actually did was when we found that we had different reactions to certain things, we started to wonder, well, if it's not collectively that we all agree to this, how important is that policy then? And so that was just something to think about is we really wanted to use the information and the data to make our decisions and not just, that I like the color orange more than I like the color green, which isn't true. I like both of those. But just as an example, we try not to let our personal preferences become the answer with that. So, so our process involved a lot of spreadsheets. And oh, look, here's more. I wasn't sure if they would all show up. Okay, so like I said, we started out with one spreadsheet where I sort of started making notes from all the policies. And then from there, we started to lump them into smaller categories. And our goal, well, actually, I'll get into this in a second. Yes, okay. So one of the things we found, like I said, as we went through these policies was if somebody came to us today and they had already built a website and they're trying to get permission to make it public or make it available, they've already spent all this money. Maybe it's something that's actually been in the works for 10 years. Maybe it already existed. And they came to us and we said, uh-oh, there's a lot of policies. There's a lot of guidelines. And we gave them our checklist. Were there policies that were more critical or actual showstoppers? That if you are not doing this, you absolutely can't have this be a public website. Absolutely not. And then from there, we wanted to look at, are there ones that are major that we would say needed to be complied with, but maybe they would have a certain number of weeks or months to comply with it, maybe in their next update or something along those lines. And then average was interesting. Average were those ones that I mentioned that maybe they're a little bit more of a personal preference or maybe get into best practices about how you might have, I don't know, spacing. That's actually an important one too. But so, and what's interesting is how different ones of us in our group who worked on this labeled things differently. And so we're still working through this to see what's going to work. And this may become overcome by events because now that we're sharing it with all kinds of people, with you guys, with digital.gov, we really wanted to get feedback and input and see, are we going down some crazy path? Does this path make sense? Is it helpful? But one of the reasons, I was going to use the word critical again, one of the main reasons we thought about this rating system was that carrot stick idea. So if I come at someone, that sounds terrible. If I come at someone with, 300 lines of policy, what are they going to do the next time? They're not going to ask me. They're going to go around me. And so we really want to encourage people to come and work with us and sort of that carrot and stick. So maybe at the beginning, we work with people a little bit more, and maybe 5 years from now, we have everybody trained and everything's perfect. And now we can apply every single policy at the same level of being critical. And so that was sort of our approach was, how do we bring people along without scaring them off with making this overly burdensome and then losing support, at different levels in the organization as well. So how do we make this something that people can accept and handle? And how do we incrementally start improving our compliance? So as I mentioned, we put together this checklist, and we wanted to create something that was somewhat easy, which is hard because policy is complex, easy to consume and have an idea of what is it you have to do. And so we broke those policies, these lines down into accessibility, analytics, branding and design, content, technology and security, and social media. And we thought that by breaking it down this way, there might be different people, if we're working with a stakeholder and they've hired a company, there might be different people in that company who care or work on different parts of this. So let's put them into separate tabs. Also kind of broke it down so it wasn't like I said, 1,000 lines. And then what we tried to do is take each requirement, each policy, and identify, like I said, whether it was critical, major, or average, and then write a compliance statement. And that was the hardest part, and we're still not great at it. We didn't want to put an entire web page of information about how to comply. We wanted to can we create a yes-no question? And if we can't get a yes-no answer, do we need to break the question down even more? Do they need to be separate lines? And then the other thing that was really important to us to do was to maintain the connection to the original authoritative source policy. So we could go back to it and make sure that we had everything, we were in alignment with that. And then we also wanted to link to on our own intranet where the policy might live, or the HHS site or the NIH site. So, where could this information be found? And then also what this did was it helped us find any gaps. So sometimes we had stuff, because we've been in business for a while, we had stuff on our intranet that we're like, okay, we can't find this in any federal policy. So do we even need to do this anymore? Or vice versa, wow, we don't have anything about XYZ. How do we explain that to people? Can we just refer them to something else? Or do we need our own little explanation that's gonna make sense? So that's sort of the approach we took to the audit and compliance checklist. And we're still sort of working through it. One of the things we did actually was to take it and assign, I think we had a group, our group's probably about 8 people that were working on this. And we assigned everyone to take the checklist and take 2 different websites that were related to NIAID in some way and go through and audit those websites and see where people didn't understand, even from what we tried to make more clear. Did 2 people come away with a different understanding of what that policy was or what it meant to comply? Did one person think the site applied and another one thought it didn't? Okay, so let's have a conversation about why we had these different opinions. And so it was really helpful to do that. So that's about that. So then I also mentioned earlier about how do we stay in touch with the new things coming in? And this is just a slightly blurry screenshot I took last night of, when the IDEA Act came out, I thought it was somewhat difficult to read. It sort of mixed together requirements for what you had to do with how to do. And it sort of went back and forth in some of the paragraphs and sections. And so we wanted to figure out, okay, what's in the IDEA Act and how does it relate to what we already know or already doing? Or does it change something? So we took our sort of audit topics that we had for our checklist and we went through the IDEA Act and sort of thought, okay, well, where does this fit in? Where does this fit in with our current thinking, our current mental model? Or do we need to change our mental model? Did we leave something out? And for the most part, we had all of it sort of already a part of something else. So that was pretty good, but it made it just easier to be able to say, okay, let's just check off where we are. Let's do our own little audit of our own site before anybody even asks us to see where we are, to see if we need to spend any resources to get up to speed before we get asked, because we don't like to fail. So we wanted to get 100%. So that's sort of our way that we're thinking about, if something else comes out next week or 6 months from now, is we would do an analysis, break it down, and see how it fits in with our existing topics. So the next step that we did was, looking at our spreadsheet here, like I said, we didn't want to have so much information in a spreadsheet. Our goal was to be able to give this to somebody who would sit down and check things off, but have links to more information if they needed it. So for example, 508 is pretty complex. I mean, to make a compliance statement, we broke it down into, are your PDFs compliant? Is your website compliant? And then have links to, well, what does it mean to be compliant? So what we wanted to do was gather our content. So we've been looking at our policy standards and guidelines content that we have on our intranet, we have in Jira, we have on a wiki, we have on, in my brain, someone else's brain, and emails, and things like that. So we have these decisions we've made, or this information that we've gathered over the years. And we wanted to look at how do we make a consistent format for that. So what we did was we created what's called a content entry form. And we use this type of form for our public website as well, and looking to use it for our intranet as well. And so we wanted to make sure we had the information framed in a consistent manner, that we started to use taxonomy, so that if we go to build a section on our intranet or a separate policy site, that we'll be able to do sort and filter. And we wanted to have examples. We wanted to identify exceptions, at least exceptions that our team would know, but we wouldn't necessarily share broadly, because we want to have conversations with people before they assume they can have an exception. And then also, again, identify the source documents. So what we did was take all the topic areas, all the policies, and divide it up amongst the team, and everybody had to write a certain number of these. So that also made our team much more knowledgeable about web policy. And so when you have to write a policy, when you have to write, I mean, we're not writing policy, but when you have to interpret it for content, you really need to understand what the policy says. And then at this point, what we're doing is I'm going back and reading some of these and working with Krista Townsend on our team, who's really been managing a lot of this. And her and I having conversations about, well, do those words mean what those words mean? So we're having these language conversations. Or what's the politics around this if we say that this is the way this is done? Is that good or bad? And how do we handle that? So there's still a lot of conversation happening around this. Our next goal is to build ourselves a policy site. Now, this may be overcome by events, as we're looking at what do we need for what we do versus what might somebody else need in another part of the government. And we wanted something, instead of having PDFs made of our intranet site, we wanted something that we could give to a contractor who was hired to build something and have them have access to these things. And so this is just another screenshot of how it could look with a search and filter and that sort of thing. So we're still in the planning stages for this, and we recognize, one of our goals when we put this together was, at NIH, there's smaller institutes and bigger institutes. NIAID is a bigger institute. And so our real goal in sharing this at DrupalGovCon and here and with others at NIH is, if somebody can take our work and use it, that would be great. If pieces get used somewhere else and then we don't have to do it, that's even better. So our goal is to sort of share information so that other people don't have to redo the same thing we've done. Because I think saving taxpayers' dollars is awesome. That's, my mom likes that too. So, okay, so let's talk about what's next. So there's actually a lot of bullets here, and I put this little sloth. I didn't know that sloths swim. Apparently sloths swim. I imagine they swim very, very slowly. And sometimes that's how it feels that we've been working with this policy stuff. So again, what's next is what we're doing right now. So sharing, collaborating, getting refinements, getting input. I mean, that's awesome. If somebody says, oh, you know what, that's not what that policy means. Great. Or, you can apply this a different way. So looking at how, some of our average items might be actually handled by the USWDS. So if we have things as our average policies that are about what bullets should be like, great. If we don't have to have that, we can pull that from somewhere else. So I think that's going to be a really cool next thing to look at. I'll skip through a few of these. Language for contracts is something that we have to look at, because I don't think the language in our contracts that end up building websites is clear enough. It doesn't contain stuff that's specific enough. And then I'll just mention this last one here about tracking down urban myth policies. So these are the ones where I'm sitting in a meeting or I see something come across the listserv and you're like, wow, they think we have to do that? Why don't I know that? Or is that even a policy anymore? Or, is that being misinterpreted? And so tracking some of those down, where different people have different collective memories of things that have come through over the years and we stopped doing them, but somebody else hasn't. So what's the actual answer here? And so those are some of the things we're thinking about for what's next. And of course, the newest kid on the block, artificial intelligence, can that help us address our policy understanding in the future, make it easier and better and all those things. So just a quick shout out to the team. And again, my cat, she worked really hard, as well as everybody else on the team. Krista and Alice and Laura really took a big chunk of it. And the rest of the team really wrote a bunch of reviewed the policies, reviewed the documentation, and also worked getting feedback from the NIH Web Governance Subcommittee. It's been really helpful. So that is my thanks to the team. And coming through for Tiger fist bump questions. You can raise your hand or type questions in the
All right, we have some questions coming in. We have a
Great.
question. First question comes from Stan. What percentage of 508 compliance is considered compliant?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I actually don't have the answer for that. So what we've been looking at trying to do for 508 compliance is approach it from what are the standard tools that we're using that we want our content providers to use. Because what we found is sometimes we'll have somebody who sends us something, they think it's compliant, and we go back and say it's not compliant. And it turns out we're using different tools. So we're trying to centralize around what are the standard tools that we want to use and what are the things in there. So some of the tools we use mention things that are critical, major, average. They might use slightly different terms. So what we've sort of done is said, the critical has to be done before you launch. Some of the major ones, if it's a barrier to access, then yes. And then if it's an average, that's something we would like you to fix. So that's the sort of the approach we've been taking, but I couldn't really give you a percentage. And also something I've been thinking about with 508 is it really is a positive thing. It's, we're creating information for people, and it's just wrong if somebody can't access it for some reason. We have the technology, we have ways, and if we don't, let's figure out the technologies. So, sometimes people think it's a really burdensome when really it's just add a data table to go with your bar chart. And I'm always constantly surprised about the resistance there, right? Like, I don't think people resist adding a ramp to a building now. It's just the way it is. So adding the data table is like adding a ramp to the building. And and so that's where I sort of think about 508 is making sure that people can get the information, because who are we to decide who gets that information and who can use it? It's not our job to decide that. Let's make it all available.
Cool, thanks, Tori.
Sure.
We have another question from Hillary. And unsure of the context of this, but you might know, what kinds of exceptions does your team make? What is that process like?
So it depends on the policy and standards and guidelines that we're looking at. So in terms of exceptions, so speaking about 508, NIH has an exception process, and there are some standard exceptions that get applied, but you do have to go through a process to get approved for those exceptions. So that's how those are handled for 508. For other items, I'm trying to think of a good example. I'm gonna have to go back to my spreadsheet, but there might be an example. So an exception might actually be that a policy might work really well for a website, but does it apply to a mobile application? Does it apply to a third-party tool? Does it apply to a site that has a database where certain things might apply, but other pieces you might have to do differently? And so that's sort of where we're looking at what are the exceptions. And then are exceptions permanent, or are they something where you're getting this exception for now, but when you redesign your site, you better address this. So I think you can have exceptions. That's how I would address it in terms of that carrot stick approach.
Okay. And sort of as a follow-up, Shannon asks, have you found cases where the policies contradict each other? And what do you do in those cases?
Contradict, I can't think of an example specifically off the top of my head, but now I'm going to be up tonight thinking about that. I do think there's some where the policy, we were actually having this debate where maybe it's just not clear enough about what a word means. So for example, the policy that there needs to be a search function on a website. Well, we were working with a website who the search only searched certain pages, but they were pulling data from a database, but they weren't storing the data from the database. So the search didn't search the data or the information. And they said, well, we have a whole filter thing and a map thing. That's our search. And I was like, oh, I would rather just search. And so we had this whole debate of, is a filtery thing? Is that search or is that not search? So I think it's more sort of getting into the weeds about some of the definitions of what's what actually works and what our users need, and how can we cycle back and define these things to be more clear and more helpful to make sure we don't go down past that, you know, we're just avoiding doing something because it's hard.
Cool. Thanks, Tori.
Sure.
Another question coming in from Sophie. Sophie asks, did you use user testing when developing your policy taxonomy?
User testing, we haven't done that yet. We do, that's actually one of our steps. So our first step was to do, use our team to do a policy compliance audit checklist, but we have a few people in mind who we've worked with in the past who really did want to comply with policy, and we want to give them the spreadsheet and ask them to use it to see if it makes sense to them. So that's one of our next steps, is to get to that, to see, you know, is it more clear than what we had in the past? Okay. Less clear? Yeah.
Okay. We have another question here, a bit of a long one.
Okay.
It says, I see machine readable privacy policies still in the required list on your spreadsheet and on DigitalGov. I thought that was based on a now obsolete protocol called P3P, or that might be another acronym that I just might not know.
Right.
Is it still valid policy, and are you aware of current guidance on how to comply?
Well, so I would say that I don't know the answer. I don't know if that, I'm pretty sure we put that on our site and that the browsers were reading it, but maybe we've done it in a different way, but I have to check.
Okay.
I think that is one of those interesting ones. I remember when it came out, it was a big deal that the browser readings could read, and if you set your browser, you know, I don't know how many people actually do that, but I think that is a good one for us to figure out. And if it's also on digital.gov, I would throw it to these guys, to you, to say, hey, you know, that's a great question. Has something changed? And do we need to word that differently, or does it need to be subsumed under something else?
Okay.
Great question.
Another one, putting your entire website in PDF format, is that compliance or avoidance?
I think that's not meeting your mission. So there's actually some interesting articles. So I have this love-hate relationship with PDFs. PDFs are great for certain things. I think eventually PDFs are good for things you need to print. But they're not great for other things. They're just not as searchable and usable and updatable. So, I mean, we have great technology. We should be using newer, more up-to-date technology for sharing information. And as we move into artificial intelligence and chunking content and sharing things across different ways, I just don't know that PDF is functional.
Thanks, Tori. Michelle asks, how is your agency handling GIS software and apps within your sites? For example, interactive maps that display site locations and addresses.
Yes. So I would say how our agency's handling that, I'm not actually 100% sure. I know we've had contracts in the past or tools in the past for different types of maps. I think at one point it was Google Maps and it was Nokia Maps and that sort of thing. This is something actually that I would say is the bane of my existence. No, it's not. But we are actually working on a white paper sort of thing right now where, and this ties into this ties into data visualization and information visualization. And I think that's a really still a difficult part for 508 compliance. I think if we're doing words and just tables, we should all be able to do that at this point, or have somebody on our team who knows how to do that. The data visualization, we have so much data and ways to communicate, and people are used to seeing visual things. How do we do that but still have it accessible? And what are the alternatives? And so that's something we're really looking at is, you know, I think people love maps. They like the idea of maps. Personally, I don't think they're, my personal opinion, nobody else's, I don't think they're that usable, especially when you live in Maryland. Like, you can't click on Maryland, right? And Delaware, that's like, it's hard. So personally, I'd rather use a drop-down list, but people like maps and they show certain things. Now, in terms of showing addresses, you know, that's gonna depend on your agency and who the addresses are for and the purpose, and you know, are there security reasons not to show something? Is there privacy reasons not to show something? You get into all that. So there's a lot of questions that get asked when you say, you know, should we be displaying data on maps? There's lots of things to answer there. But you can still think of ways to make it 508 compliant.
Okay. So everyone, please let us know if you have any further questions in the chat, but I think that's the last one we got. And also we're putting in a feedback form in there, and as a DGU plug, you can join us tomorrow, and the US Web Design System product lead will explain how we develop a US Web Design System component, starting with a problem and working to a shareable solution. And he'll answer your questions about the design system. And I put in a registration link in there as well. And at 2:30 p.m. Thank you. Anyway, well, Tori, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us. We're going to end a little bit early today. But yes, please fill out our survey, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.